Hi there, my name is Andy Farquharson and I'm your host on Alternative Exit,
the podcast dedicated to educating small business owners about the possibilities, benefits and challenges of transitioning to an employee ownership model. Did you know that there are over 200 million SMEs around the globe with an owner that will be retiring within the next 10 years? Many of these owners will never actually find a buyer for their business, forcing them to close their doors, wreaking havoc on their employees and the communities. There is an alternative. This show will explore different forms of employee ownership and the best practices for a successful transition. Each episode is going to feature interviews with experts on employee ownership, business owners who've successfully made the transition, and consultants who've helped facilitate these changes.
Okay, now let's get on with the show.
Hello, welcome to the Alternative Exit. Today we have an extraordinary guest joining us. Corey Rosen is a true pioneer in the field of employee ownership. As the founder of the National Centre for Employee Ownership, Corey has spent over 40 years at the forefront of transforming how businesses think about ownership, equity, and employee engagement. He's co-authored several influential books. One of them I have here, the other one stuck in my Kindle, that have heavily influenced me, and also many other people when it comes to the employee ownership and more inclusive principles. He's also contributed to landmark ESOP legislation and continues to shape the conversation about the future of work. Today, we're going to dive into Corey's inspiring journey, the evolution of employee ownership, and what it means for the future of capitalism and business. Corey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So, look, you've been involved in so much of this, of the evolution of employee ownership over this 4-decade career. Right? What initially drew you to the field, and how did that evolve into you founding the NCEO back in 1981?
So in 1978, I was a staffer on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Senate, and I read this article about employee ownership, which at that time was a very, very new idea. And it really piqued my interest because I wanted to find something that would make work better for people, that would create a more equitable distribution of wealth in the country, but that was also practical, because there are lots of ideas that would do those things that could never get the requisite political support or support from business or maybe support from labor to actually happen. But what was intriguing about employee ownership even back then was that it was supported equally strongly by liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans. In fact, nobody opposed it. So here was an idea that was at that rare intersection.
Yeah.
Something that really can make a difference and is also politically practical. And of course, that intersection has become even rarer today, but that still holds true for employee ownership. So I thought, this is great. Why aren't there more of these things? Which, 1978, the law creating ESOPs in the United States had only been around for 4 years, so maybe that was part of the answer. But I thought, I want to get involved in some legislation to further incentivize these plans. And then eventually decided that what was really needed was to create an organization that could get the word out so that people knew what this was, why it could be so attractive for everybody involved, but also to find out, did this really work as well as I thought it did?
Yeah.
Did it really improve corporate performance? Was it really good for workers? And what made it work? Why would some companies perform better than others? So I started the National Center for Employee Ownership in the hopes of doing those things.
Okay, fantastic. And so what did that work that you were doing there, like, it seemed to be obviously very formative for you, and obviously with support on both sides of the house makes it like fantastic and obviously easier to be able to gain momentum. But like, but it obviously still wasn't broad-based and still wasn't a concept that was obviously was supported by legislation or a lot of legislation at that point in time, or or like many examples. I mean, how did that political work that you did to work on those initial pieces of legislation shape your approach to promoting employee ownership to achieve the status it has today?
So ESOPs were created legislatively in 1974.
Okay.
And the law did provide a significant tax benefit for companies that wanted to share ownership. If you contributed to these plans, you got a tax deduction, but the employees didn't have to pay any taxes until they eventually took the money out of the plan many years later. So there were some tax benefits in place. The initial idea about employee ownership and some of the initial additional tax benefits that were created in the late 70s focused on trying to get large companies to set up ESOPs that might own 5, 10, 15, 20% of the company, particularly public companies. And this just wasn't working very well. Some companies did, but not many. But meanwhile, a number of people were saying, this would be a really good vehicle for me to exit my business. So a business owner came to me in 1978 and he said, I could sell my business to John Deere and I could get John Deere stock and I wouldn't pay any taxes until I sold that stock. Mm-hmm. If I sell my business to an ESOP, I have to pay capital gains taxes. Now, a change in the law is not going to help me because I'm going to do this, and by the time the law would get created, it'd be too late. Because I think this is the right thing to do. And he did sell to an ESOP, and his 20-some employee company is still an ESOP today with over 100 employees. But he said, we should change the law so that if I sell to an ESOP, I get that same tax deferral if I take my money and invest in stocks and bonds of other companies. So I said, well, that's a good idea, Ed. So I was able to convince my bosses that that was a good idea. And it took a number of years, it wasn't until 1984, but the law finally passed. And so this became really what ESOPs ultimately were used for predominantly, is as an exit vehicle. Mm-hmm. Because for a lot of owners, when they're thinking about moving on, they could sell to private equity, they could sell to some big company, they could just close the business down and sell the assets. And sometimes those are financially appealing, but they don't feel very good for these business owners. They don't feel like, gee, I built this legacy of a business, the employees helped me build it, I'm still going to be here in this community, and I'd like to be able to tell a good story that I sold this business to an ESOP, and the employees are doing well, the company's doing well, and I also get a lot of flexibility because I could sell some of it, and then I could sell some later. Mm-hmm. I could sell all of it, but still stay CEO if I want to, or be on the board, or do whatever I want to do with this company. I can't do that if I sell to private equity or sell to some other company. They might not even, let alone not keep me, they might keep other people in the company. They might move the company. They might change the values of my company. So if I could get a reasonably fair deal, then an ESOP sounds pretty appealing. And so what this legislation did is say, we're going to make it appealing because A, you can use pre-tax money to redeem your stock, which normally you can't. And once you sell your stock, you can defer taxes on the gain. Mm-hmm. Eventually, many years later, and I wasn't involved in this legislatively anymore, Congress said, by the way, if you become 100% employee-owned, you don't pay any taxes to the company. So
it's a huge benefit for the company, isn't it? You're moving forward.
It's also a benefit for the seller because oftentimes these transactions are financed either in part or entirely with a seller note. Mm-hmm. So if the company doesn't have to pay taxes, it's better able to pay off the seller note.
Fantastic. And so you mentioned that initially, the ESOP was very much focused on larger corporations. What are some of the changes that you've seen that have made it more applicable for smaller businesses?
Well, it really always was. It was just that the proponents of ESOPs thought that if we're really going to impact a lot of employees, we need to go after the biggest employers.
Yeah.
And, that makes sense. It still makes sense. There's an effort that was announced yesterday, in fact, called Expanding ESOPs, which is a coalition of 50 groups who are trying to reimagine what would be necessary to get larger companies to be more interested in broad-based employee ownership. So that's going to get a lot of press attention in the next few days because it's headed by Pete Stavros at KKR, which is one of the largest private equity firms in the world. So it's still worth doing. It's just that there are hundreds, 150, 200,000 businesses that are privately held that are also really good candidates for ESOP and who collectively employ maybe a third of the workforce.
Yeah.
So there's a big target there. And some of these companies are actually pretty large. Recently, for instance, there was an announcement that a company with 40-some% ESOP, Stewart Shops, it's ice cream and convenience stores in New York State with 4,500 employees, will in the next several years become majority and then 100% employee owned. So there are a lot of companies like that, and Stewart Shops has already created several hundred millionaires through its ESOP. For people working in stores selling ice cream and dairy products and 7-Eleven kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, totally. It's something that in one of the books, Ownership, you did talk about the average amount of the average held in an ESOP account was around 130K, I think it was.
It's now 167.
Is that courtesy of Stewart's? The ice cream sound like they've got a lot more in their accounts. I mean, what's the variance? Because you talked about that being the median, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
there's a lot of variance for any individual because there's so many different factors. For instance, how many years has the ESOP been in place? Because contributions are annual, you're getting more stock released to your account every year. The longer you've been there, the more you've got. So a 2-year employee is going to have a very different number than a 20-year employee. And of course, also how much is the company putting into the plan each year, and how much is the stock growing. So there's a lot of variation. There are companies where the average might be 10,000, and companies where the average might be 7 figures. But generally, if you work for an ESOP for, let's say, 20 years, you're going to get somewhere between 4 and 10 times 1 year's pay in equity.
Okay.
And it's really important to understand that is not because you are giving something else up. If anything, wages are higher in ESOP companies by about 5 to 12%. And these companies are just as likely to have a secondary retirement plan as other companies are to have any retirement plan. So it's not that companies set up an ESOP and they stop contributing, say, to their 401k plan. That's not what happens.
So employee ownership is very much it's an and. They don't have to give up anything to be able to get it.
Yeah, it's an add-on.
Okay.
Occasionally, that's not true.
Yeah.
But I would say 90% of the time it is. Okay.
So we talked about a couple of the benefits from like a financial perspective for the employees, but then also from your business to be able to operate sort of in some elements in that tax-free. I mean, there's a lot that you talk about that where employee ownership has been shown to increase worker productivity and engagement. Like, from your experiences, what are the key reasons behind this?
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of research on this, and it all comes to exactly the same conclusion, which is that the ESOP on its own is not what's driving performance.
Mm-hmm.
It's the combination of sharing real ownership with people and treating people like owners. And that ownership culture involves a few key elements. One is that these companies are very open book. So they share a lot of information with employees, not just about the overall financial picture, but more importantly about the critical numbers. So if you go to an ESOP company, you will often see a lot of discussion about key metrics within a particular group of employees. They'll be talking about, well, let's track our output on this or that, for instance, over the last month, and let's figure out how we can improve that. So they share a lot of these numbers, and then they also create high involvement management systems where the authority to make decisions is pushed farther down into the workforce, often through employee teams, cross-functional teams, ad hoc teams, where employees are given a structure and the opportunity to identify and solve problems without it's going up through the normal management chain.
Yeah.
So the best companies are the ones. I wrote a book called Beyond Engagement, How to Make Your Business an Idea Factory. And the opening line of that book is, it's simple. The best companies are the ones that generate the most ideas from the most people about the most things. And the rest is all commentary. How do you do that? How do you create specific structures for employee involvement? Now, you might say, well, if that's what's driving performance, you don't have to be employee-owned to do that. You could just do that stuff. In fact, we could just give people a psychological sense of ownership.
Yep.
And I would happily invite all of you who believe that to join me for dinner. And you can look at the menu, you can smell the aroma, you can even help me pay for it. You'll get a really good sense of dinner, but you can't eat. And a sense of ownership is about as satisfying. So what the research shows is that ownership is the glue. It's the validation, the legitimation of what you're asking people to do to think and act like owners. If you say, let's win one for the team and improve corporate performance, and the stock price will go up and the shareholders will be rich, and you'll be more satisfied at work because we're letting you make decisions, that rings pretty hollow.
Yep.
So what we found, and others have found, is that companies that set up high involvement management systems tend to find that they dissipate in a relatively short time. You get new management, or employees start to feel like, who am I doing this for?
Yeah, times become a little bit tougher, so this little extra effort seems like it's a distraction.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that getting people to work harder, and you can demonstrate this mathematically, has only a marginal impact on corporate performance. Getting people to generate more ideas and to identify more problems, and that's more important than ideas. Identifying the right problems is the most important issue. Somebody else may know how to fix it, but if the gas is leaking, you need to be able to say the gas is leaking. Does anybody know how to turn it off? And yes, any company can do this, but it's not harder work. It's not more intense work. In fact, it's more satisfying work when you're able to make these decisions to make work more efficient and productive. So that's what really changes things. But it's not easy to do. It requires a lot of change.
That was the question that I had. As you think about it does require a lot of change, like adopting those open book management and the high involvement management systems. This is a lot of effort for people to create that cultural change. So obviously, from the research, it sounds like the overhead of making those changes is more than outweighs by the benefits. Yeah.
Someone came to one of our conferences a few years ago and she was the head of another organization for stock plan professionals. These are people in public companies who administer employee stock plans.
Yeah.
And I've been to their conference too. And she said, I go to our conference and there's lots of really good information, lots of good technical panels, good sense of community. I come to your conference and there's all that stuff, but it's like an evangelical tent meeting because all of these leaders of business and employees are talking about how wonderful this is, how good it makes them feel that they're in a company that has this kind of high involvement culture. And yes, it's a lot of work, but it's not just financial reward. It is a lot more satisfying for everybody involved to work in a company like this. I remember when I used to be director of the NCEO, one of the things that gave me the most pleasure was walking by a few people who were having an intense conversation about how to do something that we were doing better. And when you get people engaged in that way, you create that sense of common purpose and community, it really transforms the work experience into something a lot more purposeful and joyful.
That is super inspiring for me and also for a lot of people out there. There's so many people who are disengaged from their work life and disenchanted with, and also with the opportunities that it holds. Obviously, we've talked, you just touched on, I guess, the second piece, which is most important for a lot of people. How do I actually have a better Monday when I go into work? I mean, what data, have you guys done any data in terms of how it actually, or done any research to demonstrate and put some data around how this actually improves people's productivity, or not so much productivity, but their health and well-being, that comes from more engagement in the workplace?
Yeah, it's very difficult to measure those things in a reliable way. So nobody has, I shouldn't say that. There was a vast research project called the Spirit something, I can't remember. It was in the UK. And they were looking at a tremendous amount of data that they had on what made people healthier that was related to work. Mm-hmm. And what they found was that people who worked in high involvement work cultures had much better health outcomes, lower blood pressure, all those kinds of stress-related illnesses were much better in these high involvement cultures. So the Spirit Factor, I think, was the project.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, I'll definitely go and check that out because that connection is. People are becoming more and more aware of the impact of their work environments having on their health. I mean, the rise of the wearables. It'd be really interesting to dig into that.
But we do know another useful measure that indirectly gets at that is turnover.
Yeah.
And employee ownership companies have vastly lower turnover than comparable companies.
Mm-hmm. GDN has another cost implication as well. It doesn't just show that it's a better work environment, but huge cost implications for those businesses.
We found during the pandemic, we studied the food industry, which was having a big problem with turnover. 70% lower voluntary turnover in ESOP food companies than comparable non-ESOP food companies.
That's phenomenal. Yeah, absolutely. Some amazing stats there. Well, so switching gears a little bit, in the book Ownership, as I mentioned, just finished reading that one. You talked about some of the broader implications of employee ownership. Could you just elaborate a little bit on how employee ownership could reshape capitalism and contribute to a fairer economy?
We're really in a crisis right now in Western economies. We're certainly in a crisis in the United States in terms of people feeling that society and business is just essentially unfair. And they're right. It is unfair. The
US isn't alone with that, Corey.
Excuse me?
The US isn't alone with that feeling.
It definitely is not. We're leading the race, I think, in that the concentration of wealth here is more extreme than in other capitalist economies, but everybody's going in that same direction. And it was what the creator of ESOPs, Lewis Kelso, back in the 1950s predicted, that wages would gradually stagnate in real terms, productivity would go up, and because of capital investment and technological investment, and all of that growth is going to be captured by the owners of capital, not by the employees. And that is exactly what happened. You can look at a graph and you can see how it starts to skew dramatically around 1974. Okay. And so, sure, people think it's unfair because it is unfair. And that's bleeding over into all sorts of other aspects of social life. People are distrustful, they're angry, they see each other's as others. And employee ownership would help address the unfairness issue, of course. There's also tremendous wealth insecurity. It's not just that we don't think it's fair, but that I don't have enough money, I don't think, to retire. I don't have enough money to send my kids to college. If there's an emergency, I can't pay for it because I don't have the wealth. The income's not enough. I need wealth as well. And this helps to solve that problem. And that wealth insecurity creates health issues for people. And the third thing is there are very few, there's a very influential book years ago called Bowling Alone. And Robert Putnam, the author, argued that we increasingly have fewer and fewer opportunities to talk to people, meet with people who are different from us in the kinds of environments that once existed. Bowling leagues and PTA meetings and having your friends over for dinner. And then we got the Great Sort, where people with similar political views started to move to neighborhoods where people were like them.
Yep.
So fewer opportunities, and even if there are opportunities, we're going to meet people like us anyway. And so increasingly become isolated from one another and unable to talk to one another. What employee ownership does, when you've got the combination of ownership in high involvement workplaces, is it gives people the chance to sit down and talk to one another, solve problems together, have a sense of common purpose and community with people who are otherwise very different from you. And to see that, yeah, we disagree about abortion or immigration or whatever, but we agree about a lot of other stuff. And they're not terrible people because they have a different point of view. And that's going away. Those opportunities are disappearing. And this is one of the few ways that's left to try to address that.
Yeah, it sounds like that's, when you describe that there, it also, for me, it sounds like it's helping people better engage in a democratic process and conversation too, by the fact that we're asking them to reach across to those different divides, to have better, more productive conversations around things that could be emotional.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Fantastic.
There are few things more important to people than the sense that somebody cares about what I think and listens to me.
You referred to a little bit earlier the work that what is the work that Pete Stavros was leading about promoting ESOPs, sort of the coming tomorrow. I mean, if we think about the other forms of legislative advocacy, what upcoming policies or reforms do you think could have the greatest impact on expanding employee ownership?
There are some what will seem like fairly technical changes that could have meaningful impact. But if we're really going to take the next step, I think what Pete is doing is the thing that needs to be done. We need to, right now, employee ownership has reasonably good penetration into that business exit market. It certainly could be a lot more. There's a lot more to be done. I wrote a bill 37 years ago that became law 2 years ago. And so sometimes you need to persist. And that law would allow the Department of Labor to fund state employee ownership programs that would create more outreach and awareness. This would be a huge step forward. the law passed but hasn't been funded. So funding this would be a big deal. So that's one of the two things. The second is that is going to address the issue of using ESOPs as a transition strategy. But it doesn't, as Pete has legitimately said, it doesn't get it into the big healthcare companies or technology companies or a lot of the public companies where employee ownership is rare. And these companies aren't going to use the kinds of ESOPs that we've been talking about this morning. They need something different, something that would incentivize them to set up the 10, 15% ESOP and see that as an add-on benefit that's worth doing because there's enough tax benefits to make it worthwhile. Mm-hmm. Right now, that's not the case. So figuring out what those incentives would be and getting the political will behind it to make it happen is the next big step. And that's what this coalition that Pete set up is going to try to do. And, it's a big hill to climb, but it helps to climb a hill when you've got backing from some private equity groups that are willing to put in millions of dollars to help make it happen. So we'll see.
Yeah, fantastic. Sounds like some very exciting initiatives. You talked, I guess that sort of there talked about some of the big challenges. I did have a question just to get your perspective of what is the biggest challenge facing the growth of employee ownership today?
Well, for the exit market, by far the biggest challenge is lack of awareness.
Yeah.
The business owners for whom this might be an ideal strategy, most of the time have no idea it's even something they could do. Mm-hmm. So imagine you're a business owner and you're thinking, I need to do something about the future of my business. And the obvious things are sell to private equity or sell to a large company. And I think, well, maybe I've heard about employee ownership. Maybe that would work. Well, nah, it probably wouldn't work because the employees don't have the money to buy me out. Well, that's not how it works. ESOPs are funded by the tax-deductible future profits of the company that the employees, of course, help create. The employees don't put any of their own money into it. But most people wouldn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, but maybe they've read an article and so they go to their accountant or their M&A specialist or their business broker and they say, how about this ESOP thing? Would that work? Well, chances are one of two things. The advisor doesn't know what an ESOP is. And if we don't know what something is, we tend to think it's a bad idea. And even if we know a little bit about it, but not enough to actually help the company do it, we might think, gee, if they do an ESOP, they're not going to use me as an advisor, so it must not be a good idea. Or more insidiously and commonly, I'm going to make money as an M&A broker or a business broker with a success fee from finding a buyer.
Yeah.
Well, if the business owner comes and says, I found a buyer, it's an ESOP, what do you think? Oh, that's not a good idea, it never works. So that's a huge barrier, is that these intermediaries who should be saying, yeah, let's think about an ESOP, are disincentivized from doing it.
Yeah.
So they need an alternative source of information about how to do that. So that's the biggest challenge.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And that makes a lot of sense. So when you think about looking back over the last 40 years, you've had a long career advocating for employee ownership. What's the one accomplishment that you are most proud of?
We had our fall forum, one of our two conferences last week in Indianapolis. And I gave the closing talk and somebody came up to me and she said, I just want you to know that the work that you and the National Center have done changed our lives, that our lives are so much better because of what we learned from you. And wow. I hear that story a lot, that We provided information to a company that got them on this path, that once they were on the path, they got information about how to do employee ownership well. And it succeeded in their company. Their company thrived, their employees thrived, they have that sense of purpose and community, and their lives are much better. And those kinds of stories are just, it's overwhelming. It's just, what could be better in life than somebody to tell you that? Yeah,
no doubt. Well, look, it's obviously, and there are a lot of those stories that I think will be testament to a lot of the effort that you've put in. So I'm sure you'll be getting a lot more. Now, as we come towards the end of this episode, I've just got the last section, which is just going to be 60-second snippets, where I'm just going to ask you 3 questions and we'll just get a quick response of you. Is that okay?
Sure.
Fantastic. So who is the leader that you most admire in employee ownership?
Jack Stack, who is excuse me?
I said past or present. That's okay.
Yes.
But
Jack Stack is the CEO of SRC Holdings, a company whose ESOP recently celebrated its 40th anniversary by announcing its stock price had grown 1,000,000% over that time.
Wow.
And Jack is the creator of the Great Game of Business, which is the iconic example of open book management and high involvement management. And he is a genuinely humble person. He does not believe that just because he's the CEO, he has the best idea. In fact, he thinks most of the time somebody else will have a better idea. What Jack has taught me is that you cannot create a high involvement culture without truly humble leaders who truly believe that other people may have better ideas than they do.
Definitely sounds like someone worth following. Okay, so we'll do. So on to the next one. What is your favorite resource on employee ownership?
Well, the National Center for Employee Ownership, of course. What else could it be?
That was a bit of a layup there.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots there. And so, the final.
We have an extensive library of materials. Yep. Some of it is available to the public in general. Mm-hmm. A lot of it is available to our members. We have an ESOP Q&A. We have a document library of all sorts of things that you'll need on this. We have a feasibility toolkit, a board toolkit. We have lots of material on communication and employee involvement. So pretty much anything that you have a question about, we have answers to in writing. Plus, we also have weekly live and recorded now webinars, and we have 2 big conferences. So the next conference will be in Salt Lake City in April. We expect about 2,000 people there. So the annual conference is probably my favorite resource thing, because it's great to see all these folks.
No doubt. And the final question I've got for you is, what would you say to a business owner who's sitting on the fence about whether or not to exit to employee ownership?
Yeah, it turns out it may not be the right idea for you, but it's worth exploring. It's worth exploring by coming to our website, by giving me a call, by contacting us and saying, here's where I am. Mm-hmm. And is employee ownership something that might be useful for me? And maybe it's an ESOP, maybe there's another form of employee ownership that might work for you. And let's just go through the basics of that and see whether it's worth pursuing further. We don't set up plans. We're not going to try to persuade you to do this if it doesn't work. But we can help you get to that point where you can decide whether it will. And then if you do, we can put you in touch with the people who can make it happen. The other thing I would suggest is talk to another company that's done it in your industry, in your city, and we can help you find those folks too. Fantastic.
Well, Corey, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
But firstly, look, thank you so much for your commitment over the last 40 years towards this, to this sort of noble cause of employee ownership. You've talked about all the amazing benefits that it provides. And so, thank you very much for sharing some of those sort of outputs and some of your thinking and the history behind them today. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy.
Before we go, like you mentioned a few things like your conferences, your research, people wanting to be able to reach out to you. What's the best way for people to follow you and to reach out?
So our website is NCEO.org, National Center for Employee Ownership, NCEO.org. You can find my contact information there, as well as other staff people at the organization. You can see there's an events tab. You can see about upcoming events, webinars, seminars, conferences. And you can also just contact us directly, and we'll be happy to point you in the right direction for the resources on our website that'll be most helpful to you.
Fantastic. And I'll make sure we've got links to all those links available in the show notes.
Great.
Corey Rosen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andy, and thanks to everybody who's listening.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to continue learning about employee ownership as an alternative exit, head across to abettermonday.me for additional links and resources. You can also make sure to subscribe or follow along in your favorite podcast app, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review.